The First Circle by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Chapter 85 of 542. At Mavrino, too, it was breakfast time. The day had begun like any ordinary day, only marred by Senior Lieutenant Schusterman's efforts to prevent the prisoners from sleeping after réveil before he handed over to the next officer. All was not well either during exercise. After the previous day's thaw, it had frozen again during the night, and the path round the exercise yard was covered in a thin layer of ice. Several prisoners came out, took one turn around the yard, found it too slippery, and went back in. In the cells, the prisoners sat on their bunks, either swinging their legs or tucking them up under them. They were in no hurry to get up, but instead scratched their chests, yawned, or cracked ill-tempered jokes about each other or about their miserable life, and described their dreams, a favourite pastime among prisoners. But although one man had dreamed of a stream of muddy water flowing towards the bridge, and another had dreamed of pulling on a pair of long boots, none of the dreams had clearly predicted that a squad of prisoners would be transferred to a labour camp that day. Solzhenitsyn, as usual, set off early to chop firewood. He'd kept his window ajar all night and opened it wider before going out for firewood. Reuben, lying with his head towards the same window, said nothing to Solzhenitsyn. He had suffered from insomnia all night, had gone to bed late, and now he could feel a cold draught coming from the window, but he was determined to have nothing whatever to do with the man who had insulted him. So he put on his fur hat with the ear flaps down and his quilted jerkin. Thus he dressed, covering himself with his blanket, and lay curled up in a ball. He did not get up for breakfast, but ignored both Schusterman and the general noise in the room in an attempt to make up his proper amount of sleep. Potapov was one of the first to get up and take his exercise and have breakfast. He'd already drunk his tea, already made up his bunk into a severely tidy rectangle, and had sat down to read a newspaper, although inwardly he was longing to get to work. Today he was due to calibrate an interesting new mechanism designed by himself. There was only buckwheat porridge for breakfast that morning, so several prisoners went without a meal, but Gerasimowicz sat for a long time in the dining hall, carefully and slowly spooning small quantities of porridge into his mouth. Nerzhin nodded to him from another corner of the half-empty dining hall, also sat down at an empty table and ate listlessly. When he'd finished, Nerzhin went back to his top bunk for the last quarter of an hour of free time, lay down and stared at the ceiling. People in the room were still discussing what happened to Ruska. He had not come back to sleep in his bunk, and it was now certain that he'd been arrested. There was a little dark cell in the staff building, and he'd been locked up in there. They did not actually call him a double-crosser in so many words, but they implied it. The general opinion was that since he'd already had a maximum sentence, they might convert his sentence from 25 years in a labour camp to 25 years solitary. It was in that year that a number of special prisons were built consisting entirely of one-man cells, and solitary confinement was becoming increasingly fashionable. Shikin, of course, would not charge him with being a double informer, but a man did not necessarily have to be charged with an actual offence of which he was guilty. If he had fair hair, he could be charged with having black hair, and yet still be sentenced to the punishment due for being fair-haired. Nerzhin was not quite sure how far the affair between Ruska and Clara had gone, and whether or how he ought to commiserate with her. Reuben threw off his blanket and got up, amid general mirth, wearing his fur hat and quilted jerkin. He never minded, in fact, when people made fun of him personally. Removing his hat but keeping on the jerkin and without bothering to put his boots on, as there were no longer much point in doing so, Reuben asked someone to pour him out a glass of tea. Sitting on his bunk without raising his eyes, his beard matted and ragged, mechanically feeding himself with white bread and butter and washing it down with hot liquid, he buried himself in a novel by Upton Sinclair, which he held in the same hand as a glass of tea. He was in the blackest of moods. Morning roll call had begun. A junior lieutenant came in and counted heads, and Schusterman read out the day's orders. As he came into the semicircular room, Schusterman announced, as he had done in the previous rooms, "Pay attention. Prisoners are informed that no one will be allowed to go into the kitchen after dinner time to fetch hot water, and no one is to knock on the door for it or call the duty cook." "Well, who gave that order?" said Prianchikov in fury, leaping up out of one of the caves between the two sets of double bunks. "The prison governor," said Schusterman. "When?" "Yesterday." With his thin, puny arms, Prianchikov shook his fists over his head, as though calling on heaven and earth as his witness. "It's impossible," he said indignantly. "On Saturday evening the minister himself, Abakumov, promised me that we could have hot water at night. It's only right, after all. We work until midnight." The prisoners greeted his retort with a roar of laughter. "It's your fault for working so late, you stupid," boomed Dostoevsky. "We can't keep a cook working all night," said Schusterman in a reasoned tone. And then, taking a list from the junior lieutenant in a chilling voice, which produced instant silence, Schusterman announced, "Pay attention. The following prisoners from this room will not report for work and will prepare for transfer. Korobrov, Mikhailov, Nerzhin, Syumushkin. All articles of government property to be collected and handed into the prison stores. And the 2 officers marched out. Like a whirlwind, every man in the room crowded round the 4 whose names had been called. People abandoned their tea, left half-eaten slices of bread and butter and rushed into groups. 4 men out of 25. It was cruel, an unusually heavy crop to take. Everybody started talking at once, excited voices mixed with others that were despondent. Some men stood up at full height on the upper bunks and waved their arms. Others clasped their heads. Others seemed to be trying to prove something, beating their breasts, while others were already shaking pillows out of their pillow slips. The whole room was one explosive babble of grief, resignation, chagrin, determination, complaint and calculation. The upheaval was of such an intensity that Reuben got up from his bed as he was, in his jerkin and his underpants, screaming in a pierced voice, "A historic day at Mavrino, the day of great purge." He spread out his arms to embrace the whole scene. His excitement did not mean that he was glad the men were being transferred. He would have laughed just as loudly if he himself were being shipped off. Nothing was sacred if you give him a chance to coin a ringing phrase. To be transferred is as fateful a juncture in a prisoner's life as it is for a soldier to be wounded. Just as a wound can be light or severe, curable or mortal, so a transfer can mean being sent near or far. It can be a pleasant change, or it can be death. Reading about the horrors of convict life in Dostoevsky, one is amazed at how peacefully the Tsarist regime let its prisoners serve their sentences in one place without a single transfer in 10 years. When a prisoner is kept permanently in one place, he gets used to his comrades, to his work, and to the prison officers. However much he may dislike the life, he inevitably adapts to it. He acquires a suitcase, either a fibre one sent from home or a prison-made plywood case. He acquires a little frame into which he puts a photograph of his wife or his daughter. He acquires a pair of slippers, which he wears in the hut after work, and which he hides in the daytime in case they are found during a search. He may even wangle himself a spare pair of cotton trousers, or he may succeed in keeping a decent pair of shoes, all of which he keeps hidden when the camp officers make a check. He even has his own needle, his own buttons which he has securely sewn on, and a couple of spare ones as well. There is a modest store of tobacco in a pouch, and if he's a greenhorn, he keeps some tooth powder and occasionally cleans his teeth. He accumulates a pile of letters from his relatives, acquires a book, and is able by exchanging it to read every other book in the camp. But a transfer shatters his little world like a thunderbolt. It always comes without warning, and the prisoner is always told at the last possible moment in order to catch him unawares. Down the lavatory go all his letters from home. If the transfer is to be made in cattle trucks, the escort will cut off all the prisoner's buttons, scatter all the tooth powder and tobacco to the 4 winds in case it might be used on the journey to blind one of the guards. If the party is to be transferred in special railway carriages with barred windows, the escort will ruthlessly trample on any suitcases which do not fit into the cramped cell-like compartments, smashing the little photograph frame as they do so. In either case, they remove all books which are forbidden on the journey. They confiscate all needles lest they be used to file through the bars or stab a member of the escort. They throw out the prisoner's slippers as rubbish, grab any spare trousers and put them into the camp stores. Thus purged of sinful attachment to personal property, of any inclination to settle down to a sedentary existence, of any tendency to relapse into a life of bourgeois comfort, rightly condemned even by Chekhov, purged of his friends and his past, the prisoner clasps his hands behind his back, and lined up in columns of 4, one step out of line and the escort will open fire. Surrounded by dogs and armed men, he sets off for his railway wagon. You will all have seen them at our railway stations, but in cowardly fashion you will have ignored them or obediently turned away like a good Soviet citizen, so that the lieutenant in charge of the escort will not suspect you of criminal intent. The prisoner climbs aboard his wagon, and it is coupled on behind the mail car. Heavily barred on both sides, invisible from the platform, the prisoner travels in a normal scheduled train, taking with him in his stuffy, cramped lock compartment 1,000 memories, hopes and fears. Where is he going? He is never told. What can he expect in the new place? Copper mines? A lumber camp? Or will he be detailed to farm work where you can occasionally roast yourself a potato or eat your fill of turnips? Perhaps he will be lucky enough to bribe someone or meet a friend who will help him wangle a job as an orderly, a hospital attendant, or even as assistant to the storekeeper. Will he be laid low by scurvy or muscular dystrophy in the first month? Will they allow him to send and receive letters at the new place? Or will they stop his correspondence for years on end so that his family thinks he's dead? Maybe he will not even arrive at his destination. Will he die of dysentery in the cattle truck? Or die of hunger because the train does not stop for 6 days and there are no rations? Or will the escort club him to death with rifle butts for attempted escape? Or at the end of the journey will they throw the prisoner's frozen corpses out of the unheated wagon like so many logs of wood? A train of cattle trucks can take a month to reach the Pacific coast of eastern Siberia. Lord have mercy on those who never arrive. And although prisoners transferred from Mavrino were treated lightly, even being allowed to keep their razors until the next stage of their transfer, every one of the 20 prisoners whose names were called out for transfer on Tuesday realised with dread what it might mean. The carefree life, halfway to freedom, that they had had at Mavrino was over.